Hi everyone, welcome to this week's text study here at St. Mark Presbyterian Church. As you can see, we're in a different space, and so it might sound a little different and look a little different, but we're having the carpets cleaned over in the sanctuary building, so we're here in the conference room with a makeshift studio, and I hope it works well for you. Today, we are in our fourth out of 5 text studies for this fall. And it's a story that's not nearly as obtuse as the story we read last week. In fact, it's one that's probably fairly familiar to some of you, at least parts of it. And it's the story of the rich man and a poor man named Lazarus. So let's read together Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 31. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received good things, and Lazarus, in like manner, evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us is a great chasm. A great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us." He said, "Then, Father, I beg you to send him to my father's house, where I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come into this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them." He said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." Abraham said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." That's the end of our text. It's the end of the story, and it's the end of chapter 16. All right, so when we do our first reading, we read through this parable, and again, I think many of you probably found at least parts of it familiar, and you want to ask yourself this question. What is this about? What is the point here? There's a lot of interesting stuff in it, but then overall, what is it about? And the question, is this even a parable? It's not introduced as a parable, like so many times, Luke will have the narrator comment, and he spoke to them this parable, or then he answered them with a parable saying, that doesn't happen here. We will look on Wednesday at the texts just before this story happens and just after, but there's nothing that sets it up as a parable per se. So is it a parable? That's a question you want to ask. And, is it a lesson about the afterlife? We'll spend some time talking about this on Wednesday as well. Kind of the evolution of the notion of eternal life, afterlife, heaven, hell, Hades, paradise, Sheol, all these words that we hear periodically in these stories. There's kind of an evolving theology about them, and we just want to see where we are when the Gospel of Luke is being written, because there's been a lot of evolution both before and after the writing of this Gospel. This is one of the few parables that spends a lot of time and gives a lot of detail about the afterlife. So, is it a parable? Or is it a lesson about the afterlife? Are we to take things parabolically, metaphorically, symbolically, or is there some literal truth here? That's the kind of stuff we want to look at in more detail on Wednesday. For now, we're going to look at the story in a couple of different ways. First, we're going to look at the characters in their life, at least their lifetime here on the earth. And the first one is there was a certain rich man. Our translation did not begin with those words, but there is a little pronoun there that's typically, if it's not part of a question, is typically translated like a certain person did this, a certain person did that. It's here when the rich man is introduced. And we don't get a name, but you may have heard the name Dives for this rich man throughout your life. And the reason is when the New Testament, written in Greek, was translated into Latin, when Latin kind of supplanted Greek as the universal language that academics would use, particularly when the Christian church and the Roman Empire wedded one another. The Greek Bible was translated into Latin. It's called the Vulgate because vulgar means common, and so it was being translated from the scholarly tongue into the common tongue of Latin, believe it or not. And the Latin word for rich is Dives. So if throughout your life you've heard this man named Dives, that is not his proper name. That's just a Latin term for a rich man. And more specifically, Luke says it's a certain rich man. And then Luke gives attention to what he wears, okay? First of all, the word is, in a lot of translations, he was dressed, which is a passive term. The verb is actually not passive, it's reflexive, which means he dressed himself. And the only reason I point that out, there's just a tiny difference, but the reason I point that out is because the rich man shows a lot of agency. He chooses and decides and says things, whereas with Lazarus, he doesn't say a word, and he lacks agency. We'll see that as we go along. So what this rich man wears is some fine wool that has been dyed in purple. You've seen references to purple and the manufacturing of purple linens and things like that, the dyeing of purple. Purple was a color that was typically associated with royalty or wealth because it's really hard to come by. And it was manufactured mostly from a certain type of fish that would be, dried out and ground and all that stuff. And they were able to make purple dye from that. It was a long process, and so it was only the very wealthy who could clothe themselves in purple robes. So that's the one thing, it's a sign of excess wealth. And linens, that's the term translated as linens is kind of a reference for undergarments, also made of maybe some of the finest linen in Egypt or something like that. So it's excessive language to talk about how delicately and expensively he dressed himself. And likewise, there's attention to what he eats. He eats sumptuously every day. It's not just an occasional meal, but this was his life, right? What he wore, what he ate signifies that he was a person of excessive wealth. So he's not just a rich man, he's excessively wealthy, to the point that he can overspend, as it were, on his clothing and on his food. And then we have another character in their lifetime, and this is a certain poor man named Lazarus. So again, that little pronoun that gets left out of our translation is there, introducing Lazarus. He's not a general type. He's a certain man named Lazarus. So here's a big deal, and here's something Luke is doing in the storytelling, Jesus is doing in his storytelling, that we want to pay attention to, and that is that you would imagine that the rich man gets named because he's kind of a big hairy deal. But in fact, it's the poor man who gets named. We never get the name of the rich man. Poor man named Lazarus. Our translation said he lay at the gate of the rich man. It's not a bad translation, but it also doesn't pick up on the fact that it's a passive verb. And he was placed, he was thrown even, at the gate of the rich man. He was cast there. He's not exercising agency and walking over there. He might be unable to walk, but he was placed there. Why there? Because here's the one person that could change his life dramatically, simply by sharing this sumptuous meal, or at least the crumbs off the table, right? So he's placed there very strategically, and yet he is placed there. It's not that he goes there himself. Lazarus doesn't really do or say anything in this story. And whereas the rich man is wearing a purple robe and fine linen undies, the poor man wears sores. He's covered with sores. So I want you to see the parallel between the sores all over his body as opposed to the nice garments of the rich man. And this is the one thing that we find out about Lazarus that shows any sort of will or hope or anything. He longed to satisfy his hunger. You know, that basic instinct we have. He longed to do that with the crumbs from the rich man's table. And then we have that reference to something that is interesting, especially how it gets interpreted. The dogs would lick his wounds. For a long time in biblical interpretation, commentaries and such, this was seen as yet another sign that this guy is just down and out and even farther out. Even the dogs lick his wounds, almost as if they're tasting him and, can't wait for him to expire so they can start eating him or something like that. So for a long time, this was interpreted as being a sign of his humiliation and another sign of his inability, lack of agency. Even dogs got to determine his life more than he did. There has been, and I don't know for how long, but there has been kind of a different wave of interpretation on top of it now, particularly coming from African communities and some Middle Eastern communities. Dogs, on the one hand, are seen as kind of scavengers. They are seen as very unclean. It could be a sign that they're just waiting for him to die. On the other hand, dogs have been known, or saliva has been known to have some healing properties to it. Of course, it can transmit disease as well, but it's known to have some healing properties to it. And there's one biblical scholar from Nigeria whose name, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it exactly. He argued that there are some archaeologists in Ascalon, Israel, who have uncovered a center where 1,300 dogs are buried in individual plots. And the site, he says, has been identified as a Phoenician semi-religious center where sick people would go, they would pay a fee, and the trained dogs would come and lick their wounds as a way of treating their wounds. Now, I don't know anything about that. Sometimes biblical commentators come up with really interesting things that help us to solve questions And sometimes they discover things that change our whole way of thinking. So I'm just going to say within time, the biblical community has kind of moved away from saying this is a sign of his humiliation to saying that even though this very sumptuously eating, radically dressed, wealthy man is not paying attention to him, the dogs are taking care of him. It's kind of a neat way of looking at the story. So that's the rich man and Lazarus in their earthly lifetime. Now let's look at them in their death. And when it comes to death, the order is switched. It's Lazarus who dies and who is then, it's a curious thing, carried away by the angels. Down. One question that's going to come up as we continue reading this is, after you die, does your body go with you? Do you become just a soul, as it were? Can angels carry a soul? Or does this language of the angels carrying him away, does that imply that he continues to have some kind of corporeal reality, some kind of bodily presence? It's a curious thing. And it could be that, now if you think the presence of the dogs licking his wounds is because they want to desecrate his body as soon as he's dead, then now you've got the angels removing the body and taking him away. It's a curious reference, and it's really hard to get back into the first century mentality to kind of have a sense of how they heard this and what it was intended to communicate. And he's not just carried away so that there's no body to be found. He's carried away and taken to the bosom of Abraham. Now, our translation does not say that. It says in verse 22, he's taken away to be with Abraham. And in verse 23, it says that the rich man looks and sees Lazarus with Abraham at his side, or with Abraham, he sees Abraham with Lazarus at his side. The literal translation is he's carried to the bosom of Abraham. And, that's kind of a funny word, isn't it? It sounds funny, it looks funny. And to think of a bosom of a man is not the way we typically would imagine hearing that term and that reference. It's got three meanings. The first is it kind of refers to the space of the chest, right? So you've got that as a possibility. The second meaning, every now and then in some of the ancient literature, someone's bosom, that phrase refers to their clothes, the garments, and a little place to store things, almost like the early archetype of a pocket, as it were, a storage place, a holding place. So you can get that sense of this is where things are held. The third possible translation, if you look this up in some of our Greek-English lexicons, is that it means it's a metaphor for something like the coastal region of a gulf. Again, kind of a holding place, but it's a geographical reference, like a bay or an inlet or something like that. So it could be that the first meaning is intended here, that Lazarus, who has been suffering so, now is actually held up against the chest of Abraham, they're heart to heart. It's almost like a child nursing at the bosom of a mother, so maybe there's kind of a nurturing intention going on here. Abraham's an interesting character, right? Often mentioned as the one to whom God was revealed and given the covenant and the promise of the generations and all of that. So everybody traces their lineage back to Abraham's father, Abraham, as it were. But he's not the one who appeared on the Mount of Transfiguration. That was Moses and the prophets. Abraham has his job, and apparently it's to be there to welcome the dead, and particularly those who have suffered, and to take them into either his bosom or the geographical reference could be into his bay, his inlet. And I'll tell you why that's a possibility in just a minute. So that's what happens to Lazarus when he dies. Whereas when the rich man dies, he died and was buried. That's it. That's the story that we get. Now, I don't want to shortchange that. Burial was considered a way of honoring someone's life, especially in the Old Testament. Someone who lived a great and loved and beloved life, they would take pains to make sure they were buried well, because that was a sign of honoring them. And even in the Gospels, we saw that after John was beheaded, his disciples got his body and his head and they buried him. And of course, we see Jesus being buried with a lot of intention. And then the women returning to the tomb, hoping to treat his body correctly, because they had to bury him in a hurry. So burial is no small thing, but this is all we hear about the rich man. He too dies. The poor man, Lazarus, dies. The unnamed rich man dies. That's what humans do, and they share that in common. But after they die, things go quite differently. So, in the afterlife, I'm just going to call it that. That term doesn't come up in our reading. The formerly rich man, that's how I want to refer to him now. Everybody knows that except him, apparently. He finds himself in Hades. Now, it's a little unclear whether he's in Hades, Abraham with Lazarus in his bosom, or somewhere else, or if the whole thing is just kind of called Hades. We're going to spend a little time on Wednesday looking at this word Hades and how it is one of those concepts that has evolved a lot over time. See, the question becomes, is this story intended to be the definitive description of what the afterlife looks like? If so, it raises a lot of questions. Or is it a parable? And as a parable, it can just kind of have its own world, but there's no need for us to imagine that that's exactly how the afterlife is going to be for us. That's why I think that question, is this a parable? It's actually a very important one. And we want to keep tabs with that. They're in Hades. I gave you the Greek word for that. Let me just explain to you. So in this word, you see that what looks like a little comma and an accent mark over that capital A. The accent mark is an accent mark. So the accent is on the first syllable of that word. The comma looking thing, or the single quote looking thing, that's actually, that indicates a hard breath. It tells you how to pronounce it. And this is where a lot of Greek words that when they get transliterated into English have an H on them. The H is not written out as a letter, it's that hard breath. And so like words that begin with the prefix homo, for example, the letter omicron is the first letter. It's got that hard breathing there. Same thing here. This is Hades with a hard breath. Hades, it's transliterated for us as the word Hades. On your handout, I list 9 other scriptures where this word Hades appears. And so if you want to spend a little time between now and Wednesday doing a little scripture scramble and checking those out, I gave that to you. If you look up the word Hades in a Greek-English lexicon, the first thing they're going to say is it's a proper name in Greek mythology. Hades was the god of the underworld, sometimes called Pluto. And you read that in Homer, as well as all of the other Greek language ballads. Sometimes it's a reference to what's sometimes called Orcus, the underworld, the netherworld. In the Old Testament, there's the Hebrew word Sheol, which when the Old Testament was translated into Greek, into the Septuagint is called. The word for Sheol became Hades. So that's part of that evolution of the imagination of the afterlife. And it shows the influence of the Greek Empire and Greek philosophy. You could argue that without that, the Old Testament in and of itself, Sheol just means the grave. You know, that's just where one spends eternity dead. But there was an evolution that could be where one spends eternity, but not dead. In fact, we're going to see that this man is in torment. Torment. It's an awful term. In the Gospel of Mark, when the man with a legion of demons sees Jesus, he said, "Please don't torment me." This speaks about unspeakable agony. And so you got the formerly rich man, he's in Hades, and he's in torment, and he can see Abraham and Lazarus somewhere far away. Not so far that he can't talk to them and them talk back. So they're close enough to communicate and close enough to see. And how he knows it's Abraham, I don't know. But he can see them, they can see him. He can hear them, they can hear him. But he's in agony and they're not. So that's part of the evolution of what the afterlife might look like. So let's continue. The formerly rich man is in Hades. He sees Abraham and Lazarus. And the first thing he does, he calls out to Father Abraham, so he's Jewish. And he asks for mercy. Literally, mercy me is the request he makes. So on the one hand, it looks like he's been humbled by death and by his suffering. He now is seeing Abraham and making a request for mercy. On the other hand, it doesn't seem like he's changed much at all, because the first thing he asks Abraham to do is to send Lazarus over to dip his finger in the water and cool the man's tongue. I mean, that degree of torment that's implied by the idea that just one drop of cool water on the tongue would change his reality. That's kind of heartbreaking to think about that. But what's not heartbreaking, what's kind of disappointing, is this man still thinks he's better than Lazarus, as if Lazarus is just a tool, a means to an end. And now he's asking Abraham to tell Lazarus to come fetch him some water. Not only does he see Lazarus just like he did in life and seems unchanged in that respect, he also later starts arguing with Abraham. And what that tells me is that initial plea, Father Abraham, have mercy on me. This is the kind of thing he did in business all the time. You encounter a king or somebody with more money or somebody with greater power, and you kowtow to them a little bit. You show proper deference. But then you talk to other people like Lazarus, like they're your slaves or something. He kowtows to Abraham initially, but later he's going to argue with him. So he still hasn't let go of his sense that his privilege is somehow makes him superior. The one redeeming quality we might see in this guy is that he is a bit worried about his 5 brothers who live in his father's house. And he wants to send Lazarus over to them. Okay? So, we got Lazarus in the afterlife. Perhaps this whole area is called Hades. But he's in the bosom of Abraham. He's doing nothing. He's saying nothing. And then you've got the rich man who initially asked for mercy. He's in torment. He sees Lazarus perhaps fetching him some help. He argues with Abraham. He wants to try to get his brothers to repent so they don't end up with him. That to me is the one redeeming quality this guy shows. Now, it's kind of interesting that when Abraham describes Lazarus, he describes him as having once received evil things. So he's in Abraham's bosom. He once received evil things, and now he's comforted. And that's how the reality was for Lazarus. Now let's look at the final character in Hades. And this is the character of Abraham. We did not see Abraham on the Mountain of Transfiguration. This is one of the only appearances of Abraham as an active being, not simply a progenitor, in the New Testament. He reminds the rich man of how things were when he and Lazarus were both alive. So that's the first thing he said. When he's asked to send Lazarus, his argument initially is, look, you're in torment because of how you lived. He's here getting comfort now because of how he suffered. He doesn't really do a lot of blaming. He simply says, that's how it was for you in life. This is how it was for him in life. This is how it is for you now. This is how it is for him now. He's very kind of forthright about that. Then he says, but I can't send Lazarus to you because look, there's a big gulf between us, and we can't get over there, you can't get over here. That's why some people think the translation of bosom as a metaphor for a shoreline on a gulf is probably what that intends. He's on Abraham's side, he's in Abraham's territory, whereas the other man on the other side of the gulf is in Hades, as it were. So he cannot send Lazarus, even if he wanted to. He can't do it. The afterlife is structured to where that's not going to happen. And he will not send Lazarus back to the man's brothers. He doesn't say he cannot. He says, there's no need. The man says, send him to my father's house for my brothers so they'll repent. And his answer is no. They have Moses and the prophets. They could listen to them. And of course the man argues with him, but surely they'll listen to someone like Lazarus who rises from the dead. And the man says, well, no they won't. If they won't listen to Moses and the prophets, they won't listen to someone who rises from the dead. And that's how the story ends. And so we're going to leave it in just a second, but I do want to ask the question, with whom is Abraham really arguing here? Let's think about what this ending of the story means for different people. Is he really talking about Lazarus' brothers, or the rich man's brothers? Or is he talking about the community to whom Jesus appeared after his resurrection? What is that last statement really saying? And that's where we're going to leave it. And we'll meet again on Wednesday. We'll discuss this at 10 a.m. I would love to hear your take and your questions on this story. It's a familiar one, but boy, it raises a ton of questions. And we'll take some time to hold them. So I'll see you then. Thanks.